Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and our work is about building a more empathic world. And I'm here today with Jessica Jackson Sloan, and Jessica is a human rights attorney, national director and co-founder with Van Jones of an organization called Cut50. It's a national bipartisan effort at reducing America's incarceration rate. And she also serves as mayor of Mill Valley, California. So thank you for joining me for this discussion.
So good to be on. Thanks for having this discussion and highlighting the empathy work we're doing.
Oh, great. Well, that's why I contacted you, is I saw that you have the Cut50 started a day of empathy, which I see here is a national day of action to generate empathy on a massive scale for millions of Americans impacted by a criminal justice system. Yay!
Yay.
And it's you've got a website, dayofempathy.com, and it's scheduled for March 1st. Is that right?
So last year was March 1st. This
Okay.
year is March 6th, but it's always that first week of March.
Oh, okay. And well, that's what we wanted to talk about is like, how did this Day of Empathy come about? You know, what's the vision for it? You know, what events are planned, and just hear more about this event.
Yeah. So the Day of Empathy really stems from one of Cut50's core values and core missions, which is to increase empathy by really changing the narrative around criminal justice reform. And we believe we can only do that by empowering those who have been directly impacted to speak up and share their stories. For me, this is sort of personal. When I was 22, my husband was incarcerated, and I felt like I couldn't talk to anybody about it. You know, I'd grown up here in Mill Valley, and I didn't know anybody who'd been in prison. Everybody I knew who had had a drug problem ended up in rehab. So I was embarrassed, and I was humiliated, and I was very, very isolated because of the stigma around having a loved one incarcerated or somebody being incarcerated. So when I co-founded Cut50, part of what I really wanted to achieve was a decrease in stigma in talking about incarceration and the impact it has on our families and on the people who are incarcerated. We've done that through the narrative change, and Day of Empathy is just another way we're doing it by getting those who have been directly impacted out to state capitals, talking to state legislators, you know, having some real one-on-one conversations and building relationships that go beyond any statistics that you can offer about the justice system, beyond any anecdotes that might be in a report, to really, you know, showing the personal impact in creating empathy from those conversations.
Well, I saw a video you had from the event in Sacramento from last year. So it looked like there was a group of union members who marched to the Capitol steps. You held a talk there. There was different politicians and different activists talk. You had signs saying Day of Empathy. And then after the talk, you went in and I guess talked with legislatures.
So each of the events across the country looked different. California was a special event in that they had the rally. Not all of the events had the rally, but we did have events in 35 different states last year. We're hoping to increase it this year. And what that looked like is that we were lucky to get a grant from Google that included a portion of money to re-grant to community organizations throughout the country that are doing great work, that are led by directly impacted people, and majority of them were minority led as well. And they were doing phenomenal things. They just weren't connected to any larger networks and really didn't have the resources to be putting on an event like this and building these relationships with state legislators. So we worked with them to figure out, you know, what they wanted to focus on during their ledge visits, put them in contact with state legislators, make sure that we had media up there as well to capture the moment and really spread that this is something that's working. And then we gave them a grant, and they all pulled off incredible events. California, one of the highlights of California was the fact that we had so many directly impacted people, and they weren't just people who were formerly incarcerated. They were people who had been incarcerated, people who were children of currently incarcerated, mothers of crime victims, law enforcement. They all came together to really talk to the legislators, and I think they met with over 150 legislators that day about how the criminal justice system is not working right now, and the fact that we feel strongly that because crime hurts, justice should heal.
Well, how did you come up with the idea for a day of empathy, the value of empathy? Because we've been working on it for about 15 years, saying we really need to raise the level of empathy in society, and it's a core foundational value. And so I always track what's happening, through Google Alerts, what's happening around the theme of empathy. And something I've noticed is Van Jones has talked a fair bit about empathy, and he's, a co-founder with you of Cut50. And he's talked about empathy, the need of empathy for bridging the political divide. And he's actually, on his show and CNN and so forth, he's gone out and actually reached, as a progressive, he's gone and reached out to conservatives and talked with them and so forth. So I guess I'm looking at how did the idea, for your organization to put on a day of empathy kind of come about, and what was the inspiration for that? And yeah.
Well, the Day of Empathy really was something that Van believed in strongly, and the team decided to focus on, because like you say, we're moving some pretty tricky legislation through state and federal, and it's really focused on the relationships. In order to do so, we really have to focus on the relationships and the coalitions that we're building. And the way that we've been able to be so successful in bridging that bipartisan gap and working with folks like Newt Gingrich or Grover Norquist or the American Conservative Union, the way we've all been able to come to the table and find legislation that we agree on is by focusing on the stories of what's happening to people, the directly impacted folks. So we saw that empathy created a space for all of us to be able to work together on legislation. And Van believed strongly that we needed to scale this empathy and get out to every state capital in the country with people who are directly impacted, so that the legislators there can begin to see people as people and understand these are human beings who are having these horrific experiences with our justice system and who are in need of change, rather than just looking at statistics and reports and hearing anecdotes from others who are representing them. So we believe firmly in empowering those who have been directly impacted to share their own stories, and that will create empathy. So I guess it's Van's fault that we picked going into 50 states all in one day. He's a bit of a dreamer, but it's been an incredible experience, and we're so excited for it again in a couple weeks.
So what I'm seeing is two sort of aspects of empathy. One is having empathy for fostering a dialogue across the political divide, and working together to solve a problem together. And then the other way of fostering empathy is for people who are affected by the criminal justice system to be able to actually share a personal story and how they've been impacted by the justice system, and actually share those stories with the politicians and legislators. Is that accurate? Or
yeah, no, I would say that's definitely accurate. It's amazing to me how on paper we might all disagree with something. Take the bill we're working on for dignity for incarcerated women. If I was to come and say, well, there are bad things happening in our women's prison, legislators might say, well, I haven't heard of it, or I don't know what you're talking about. Surely things are on the up and up in the prisons. It is a very different conversation when I bring women to the table and they are able to sit there and talk to legislators or talk to partners or folks on the other side of the aisle and describe the experiences they've had, whether that's being shackled during the process of childbirth, turning one of their most joyous moments into one of the most traumatic moments of their life. If it's having male guards standing there strip searching them while they're a sexual abuse survivor, and what that impact is and trauma is that they take from that.
So we just had a break in the video. So you were just sharing, what is it that the people who have been incarcerated can share, the experience that they can share with legislators?
Yeah, it's their direct perspective, their experiences, the trauma that they have dealt with, the impact it has had on their lives. It is just so powerful for them to share these experiences. And for example, the Dignity for Incarcerated Women's Act, we went to Senator Cory Booker's office a couple weeks ago with a group of women who had been in federal prisons, and some of them had been in state prisons as well. And they talked about, the experiences that they had had while they were in prison, whether that was being shackled during childbirth or denied basic hygiene products that they needed monthly, or having male guards standing in the showers, staring at them while they were naked taking a shower. And not only did they say what their experience was, but they were able to articulate, the impact that it had on their lives and the trauma that these kind of experiences caused. And they can do so in a way that no report, no statistic, no anecdote presented by anybody who wasn't there can do. It just resonates, the power of their personal stories and the relationship that they build with the legislators from sharing those stories.
Well, something that we're working on is kind of looking at the larger picture, like how do we redesign society to place empathy, at the forefront around all the different issues. And we've done things like with an empathy tent, we've gone to Berkeley where there's been these left-right, political battles and offered mediation between the sides and offered listening. And so we're looking at the larger picture. So stepping back, in the justice system, what role do you see of empathy in the larger justice system? Like the justice system, in a sense, is based on, judgment, sort of like it's almost a gladiatorial structure. You bring in two lawyers and they kind of battle it out. So it's a competitive, it has a competitive aspect at it. And it's very retribution based. So it seems like for us, it's like really fostering more empathy in the system itself would be, is really important to move from kind of a retributive justice system to let's say a restorative justice system. And you see, restorative justice used in a lot of different environments. So do you address that aspect as well, kind of that bigger picture of redesigning the justice system to be more empathically oriented?
I definitely think that's where we need to go. The justice system exists for several reasons. One is incapacitation, one is retribution, and one is really to rehabilitate people. That's the theoretical reasons we have a justice system. Now, I think over the years, maybe because of political polarization or because of this decision by politicians to appear tough on crime in order to be elected, we've moved drastically away from the rehabilitative portion, and prisons and jails have grown to be used simply for retribution. This is unfortunately not healing anybody. You talked a little bit about the courtroom dynamic of a defense lawyer and a plaintiff's lawyer. Just sitting back and looking at that process and having been in that process on the defense side, it's not a healing process. It's not a process that looks to right or restore or heal or rehabilitate anybody. It's a process that, like you said, is adversarial. If you walk into my office as a public defender and you come in there and have been accused, I'm going to, look at the evidence and figure out how to plead you not guilty and make sure that you don't go to prison. The district attorney is going to talk to the witness and to the victim. But overall, they represent the people supposedly, but they're not actually representing the people because they're goal is to make sure people go to prison. And right now our prisons aren't a place of rehabilitation. They're not a place where anybody gets the help that they need. So when people are exiting the prisons, they're more traumatized, they have fewer options, less paths to success and to become contributing members of society. So it actually decreases our public safety. So if a prosecutor is actually representing the people, they should be looking at ways to keep people from going to prison and instead just cure the underlying reasons why they're committing these crimes in the first place and help restore them so that they can be successful and not continue to commit crimes and create victims. So I think empathy is needed on both sides of the aisle to understand, what is happening. And that's the goal of restorative justice, is to really move to a place of healing and restoring and making sure that people are moving forward from whatever bad decisions they've made or whatever harm has been caused to them in a way that they're going to be successful in the future.
Well, even looking at that moment of harm that someone did, for example, we just have a school shooting that happened in Florida, and the perpetrator shot 14, actually killed 14 students. So that's the moment of lack of empathy on the perpetrator's action. And then there's that whole story of what happened upstream, what happened to bring someone to that point where they have such a lack of empathy and care that and what can we do, to upstream to really build a culture of empathy that can head off a lot of this, crime. And it seems that an act of crime is, in a sense, an act of a lack of empathy. It's an empathy deficit. If you're stealing, you're not thinking of the well-being of the person that you're stealing from. If it's beating somebody up or any of the things that are usually considered criminal, is an act of a lack of empathy. And how do we go upstream to really create a culture that's more empathic? So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, no, I think it's important. And, that's why we're excited to have the Day of Empathy and have it be such a scaled event that it's in every state, because it does start with empathy. And it starts with being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and think through what their circumstances might be. You bring up the Florida shooter, and I'll tell you, I imagine he's going to be facing the death penalty. And prior to coming to Cut50 and co-founding Cut50, I represented death row inmates in their state and federal habeas appeals here in California. And before that, I was actually working on some death penalty cases in Florida while I was in college. But, as far as empathy goes, that is the ultimate illustration of a lack of empathy, because this is not a child who is just born bad. I strongly believe no child is born bad. They are a product of their environment. They are a product of the resources around them. They are a product of the trauma they experience. One of my favorite parts of doing death penalty representation was kind of getting to learn the why, getting to understand how they got to that moment. There's two phases to a death penalty case, the guilt phase, and then there's the penalty phase. So first, did the person do it or not? Are they guilty? And second, should they live or should they die? As part of that second phase, and really as part of the first phase as well, an attorney is expected by the ABA standards to go out and do a thorough social history review, to talk to the doctors of that, person from when they were a child, their nurse, their teachers, their parents, their neighbors, their friends, to look at the household they grew up in, the environmental factors around them, the mental health, even to look at intergenerational trauma, to get kind of a holistic idea. And I'll tell you, every single one of these cases that I was able to do that on a habeas, and really look at their life in a holistic fashion, not just focusing on the moment they committed the worst decision they would ever make. It was like watching a train crash in slow motion. There were so many systemic failures, so many opportunities that had one person stepped in and gotten them the resources they needed, the entire crime could have been avoided. That entire decision wouldn't have happened. So in a lot of ways, we need systemic empathy. We need people who are looking at children in our foster care system now, or children in under-resourced communities, or children who don't have the options they need to succeed, or the education that they're going to need to succeed, and the addiction support, the mental illness treatment. We need people to be looking at them.
So you were talking about your experience as a defender, I guess a public defender, defending people who have perhaps, is that what you're saying, was actually had done murder or
who are on death row? Yeah,
on death rows.
State and federal habeas appeals. So
okay, so you dealt with people, and you're saying, and we had a little crash there with the video, that you've really seen their experience. You've had to research what was going on, what their experience was, and that you, with this, you could really see that what was needed was really a systemic importance of empathy, that at any point in their life, maybe a more empathic connection with someone who would listen to them, talk to them, hear them, or something like that would have created maybe a sense of connection, could have headed, like you said, it was a slow, their life was a slow motion, car wreck, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you could see so many different places where had somebody had empathy for them and not just written them off as a bad kid, they could have gotten the resources they needed to avoid that tragic moment later on in their life.
So is, stepping back again, so building a culture of empathy, what do you see as, like, that's kind of our vision, and you're working on this project, this day of empathy. What do you see as the larger social approach to creating a culture of empathy, where we really have empathy as as a primary social value? Is that something you think about, or contemplate, or?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is exactly what needs to happen. We need to be having more and more conversations and empowering people who have been directly impacted, whether by the justice system or otherwise in their life, to come forward and talk about what's going on, and really need to create the space. And I think, I see this as my role and the view of other those of us in the movement, to create the space to have those conversations and bring people together who otherwise would not be in conversation and not get the opportunity to hear each other's perspectives and support them.
Yeah, something I've looking at is there's so many different social movements. There's the sexual harassment movement, the Me Too, there's the immigration issues, there's the racial issues, there's the justice, incarceration, which you're focused on. That at the core of each of these seems to be the importance of empathy, and it's really bringing these different movements together around empathy. For example, the Me Too movement, the woman that started, yeah. She talks extensively about empathy. That it was after having this sexual harassment, that she felt alone, alienated, and it was really being able to talk to others and having that connection that was really the healing aspect, as well as if with sexual harassment, again, would be a lack of empathy between the harasser and the harassee, for example. So maybe it's the teaching and the valuing of everybody's humanity and their experience, and having empathy for that. So just, I guess, a question about seeing empathy in this broader context to bring social movements together.
Yeah, and I think that's important, and even on an individual basis, right? I know Me Too has been a public sort of internet and social media campaign to raise awareness of the fact that so many women are impacted by workplace harassment, or just harassment and sexual assault. But just the individual healing that could happen on a smaller scale, right? If a man has been out there sexually harassing women, maybe he doesn't understand the impact that it has on their lives, to be fearful to, let's say, walk down the street that he's catcalling on, or show up at work every day expecting comments that are inappropriate. Perhaps he doesn't understand what their experience has been like, and perhaps it's enlightening to them to understand what his experience is and why he thinks that this is something okay to do. And hopefully both parties can walk away from a conversation like that with an understanding of each other's perspectives. And, you can heal some of the trauma and get an apology where it's necessary, as well as, for the man, hopefully it can be enlightening enough to change their behavior, man or woman, I should say. Certainly both parties are capable of sexual harassment. But I think, if empathy was to be employed both at a smaller scale as well as at a larger scale, what if the media had empathy? You brought up the Florida shooting case. We've seen him described as a troubled teen or coming from a difficult background, and a lot of conversation. Within the first few hours, I knew, he had been adopted early on. His adopted father had died. He had recently lost his adopted mother. All of these sort of mitigating factors that might make a person say, wow, this is not just a terrorist who's gone and shot up a school, but this is a human being who's been through a lot. And maybe this is part of what drove him to make that disgusting, horrible decision. You don't see that in most of the cases that the media reports on. You see them more or less, trying to scare you as to who this defendant or suspect might be, and really not talking about the mitigation. Now, that's not to say they shouldn't do that in the Florida case. I think they absolutely should, but they need to do it in all cases. The media needs to have empathy and put the mitigation and put the stories out there and humanize everybody. Tell the story. That's your job as the media. Tell the story, report on the facts. And it's important that both sides, both the victim and the defendant or suspect have that opportunity to be humanized. And I think it's helpful to the conversation as we figure out how to heal from something as disruptive and traumatic that's being felt, all across the country as this high school shooting is.
Yeah, that's what I would see as the media could be more of a mediating, healing force where they share the stories from all sides and help integrate those stories. And in fact, next week I'm interviewing an author, a journalist who just wrote a book on the need for an ethics of empathy in journalism. And in terms of, you mentioned the catcalling, that we have this empathy tent, which we set up in Berkeley and other places, and we offer, like I mentioned, listening. And one of the times a woman came by, and she was like totally upset. She'd just been catcalled and was like really upset. And one of our mediators was sitting there saying, "Oh, what's going on for you? What's happening?" And she said, "Come talk to me." And he actually listened to her, about what was going on with her. And then the person that was doing the catcalling saw that, and he came over, and I listened to him and started doing empathic listening with him. And then we sat them both down together, and they started doing empathic listening with each other, and they were actually able to work through the issues to really share their experience, how she felt heard, how he didn't mean to, he thought responsibility was important. And they actually had a dialogue, and she started giving him advice on how to really, talk in a way that didn't upset, a woman. So I think that was just a real illustration of what's possible. So thank you for this discussion. Is there anything in closing about empathy or anything we didn't cover that you think is important to cover?
Well, I would just say that I'm excited to have this conversation with you, even more excited to know there's, somebody out there studying this and figuring out how we can scale empathy, and let's stay in touch.
Okay, look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.